decline in the United States. And so while these individual mass shootings are horrific, and we need to look at ways to prevent those from happening again, overall in the United States, gun violence has significantly declined. There's essentially two ways to look at, well, there's not two ways, there's a lot of ways, but the two prevailing views on what to do about gun violence, a traditional liberal would say we need to control who has guns. And so they would say background checks, they would regulate the size, the amount of ammunition or the clips, they would regulate what guns you can get a hold of. The downside, and what I believe that where that argument fails is they presume that if we tell people you can't own this, that they won't get that. I think that fails. And I think if you look at around the country, a lot of shootings happen in the places that have the strictest gun control, or they happen in places like gun-free zones. A lot of, almost every major mass shooting has occurred in a place that bans weapons. I don't even know off the top of my head, but my presumption is OTC is a gun-free zone. You know?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so that means technically you're not supposed to bring a gun into the school. I'm going to go out on a limb and say somewhere here in this building today, there are probably people that have guns, but concealed. They probably own them legally, they probably carry them legally, they probably carry them in here today. I don't believe that just telling people you can't carry a weapon into a building prevents them from doing that. And so a traditional liberal would say we should get rid of guns. I would take a different approach, and I would say we should do a few things. One, we probably have, or we don't probably, we do, have a significant problem with mental health care in this country. We have a lot of people that have significant mental issues that we don't give the treatment to that they need. I think if you look back at the Virginia Tech shooting, the guy named Cho was a classical case where everybody was saying this person has significant mental health issues, he needs treatment, he's not safe, and he slipped through the cracks over and over and over again until he ended up shooting a bunch of people at the Virginia Tech campus. That's one thing. Obviously, I am not personally a big fan of gun-free zones. The reason I'm not is because I think that the people that follow the rules of the gun-free zones are not the people that are going to shoot everyone out. They're the people that follow the law. And so I think a classical case, if you look, you compare two shootings in the state of Virginia. The Virginia Tech shooting was a gun-free zone. Virginia Tech was gun-free. Cho comes on campus, I believe he had 2 9mm, both with maybe 6 magazine clips. These were not very large clips he was carrying. And he kills a bunch of people. There's nobody there to shoot back. A few years earlier, there's a law school in Virginia, Appalachian School of Law. A person comes to campus with a gun because they want to shoot their professor and their classmates. And there are students there, that is not a gun-free zone, there are students there that were carrying concealed weapons. He opens fire, they shoot back, and eventually they shoot him, and only, I think, 1 or 2 people were injured in the shooting. I think, now every case is a little different, but I think that is a textbook example of how someone who legally and responsibly carries their firearms protects people against somebody who is going to break the law either way. So I would say mental health training, I would say the elimination, but significantly shrinking the number of places that are gun-free zones. I don't think that does anything to really protect people, would be my recommendation. And then, like I said, I think the evidence bears out that gun violence in the United States has declined significantly in the last 20 years as we've allowed more concealed carries, things like that.
Thank you.
Yes.
I noticed on your website that your platform...
First of all, my website is ridiculously out of date. It's like 5 years old, so I apologize for that. I
thought it was fine, but I saw that your very first thing on there was about regulations, lightning regulations for businesses. I'm wondering what particular regulations you would want to roll back and if they would have an effect on our environment, as well as if the benefits to
Sure.
businesses and the community.
So a good example of what I think we don't need to do, there's something that is, well, it's all over, called occupational licensing. What occupational licensing is that there's a lot of interest groups that will come to the government and they will say, for our particular field of work, we think that you should have to get a license before you perform that. So a good example would be hair braiding. Currently in the state of Missouri, and I can't remember what the specifics are, but it's like you have to pay $500, you have to do 800 hours of time and all this kind of stuff before you can get your license. And if you don't get licensed and you're braiding people's hair without that license, then you can be fined by the government. Well, that's ridiculous. Like, you can't hurt somebody by braiding their hair. I mean, but it's not like you're performing surgery on people and you're just like
So
wandering
you're
them
not-
off the street.
So you're not talking about manufacturing regulations?
Well, I am, but so an occupational license is a regulation because you're regulating who
Right.
can enter the workforce.
That's, yeah, but I mean, I'm talking about manufacturing and clean air regulations, things of that nature.
Well, for instance, like, one of the differences between the current administration and the last administration has to do with nuclear energy. The last administration was very opposed to allowing the expansion of nuclear power plants in the United States. The current administration has rolled back a lot of those environmental protection requirements for nuclear power plants, and we've actually got, for the first time in like 15 years, we have new nuclear power plants under construction. They're purchasing land, they're starting that process. I believe nuclear power is a safer, cleaner, better alternative to coal power. But because of the last administration's rules on it, no one wanted to create a new nuclear power plant. So I think that's an example of a federal regulation. As they roll that back, you're starting to see new and better energy grow up. Yes?
What part of your plan is to make sure that, like Missouri elections in the future, that they're fair and ethical, like accountability in elections, basically that people that are not really registered to vote are voting anyway?
So we passed, in the last legislative session, we passed a photo ID bill. Now, it's a fairly watered down version of that, but what it essentially says is that if you want to vote, right now, if you want to vote, there's a certain amount of IDs that you can bring and you can use and show them. In fact, I may go vote absentee today that says you can vote. One of which, the most common, which is a driver's license. But currently in Missouri, you could bring a utility bill. It just has your name on it and your address. And as long as that matches up in the system, you could vote. This last year, we passed a bill that, piece of legislation that said, if someone brings a identification that does not have their picture on it, they essentially have to be read a statement or sign a statement that reminds them that if they are illegally voting, that if they're trying to use someone else's stuff to vote, that that's a felony and they can be prosecuted for that. Some states have done a full requirement that the only way you can vote is if you have a photo ID. You have to present the ID, they have to compare the picture on the ID with you before you can vote. Missouri's not gotten quite that far. We've actually passed that once or maybe twice in the past, and then the court struck it down. What they said is that they believe that represented a burden on predominantly poor individuals that may not have a driver's license. And so Missouri has tried to find a way to comply with that court requirement, but that's the primary thing that people are doing. Obviously, there's a lot of internal stuff that we don't do legislatively. You'll have the clerk of courts or the secretary of state that will go through voter registration rules and try to cull out those people that have passed away, moved away, things like that. But voter ID is probably the most prominent national way that people attempt to do that. Yes?
Two-part question. Why do you think there's like so much resistance with Congress and the president right now? And do you think like the Republicans and Democrats can gather like bipartisan support on offshore accounts that the Congress basically has to bring it back to the state?
So the second issue, are you talking about?
Basically, they like, because you know that money is not taxed.
So you're talking about repatriation.
Yeah.
So what the second, well, we'll go with the second one first. So what he's talking about is a lot of major companies make, sorry, is it bothering you that I keep walking back? Okay, I have a tendency to walk and move around. Anyways, so what he's talking about is, for instance, like if Apple opens in India and they make a significant amount of money, right now they are just leaving that money off, like outside the United States. They're not bringing that money back in the United States because they don't want to pay the 35% tax rate that they would have to. Some in Congress have recommended what's called a repatriation, which is essentially a short-term or long-term reduction in the tax code on that money. So right now there's several $billion sitting out there that's not been brought back. There's been some discussion if we did a 1 or 2 or 5 year reduction from 35% down to 10%, that these companies would say, okay, now we want to bring that money back in the United States so we can spend it here. They did this about, I think they did it in the first George W. Bush term back in like 01, 02. It did not generate as much money as people thought it would. I generally think it's a good idea. I don't think that money's going to come back until we do a repatriation. Second, or the first part of that question was, Why is there so much resistance between the president and Congress? Partially, I think one of the reasons is our legislative branch is set up so there's conflict. The House is elected in small districts, the Senate by the states, the Senate terms are staggered differently, the House terms, the president by the nation, and so everyone has a different interest group. The president represents everyone. Our congressman here in Southwest Missouri represents what we believe. He doesn't represent California, New York. The president represents everybody. So I think partially it's because there's supposed to be some gridlock, and it's supposed to be hard to pass new legislation. The other part of that is we live at a time, I think a lot of it deals with the rise of social media, where people have become very ingrained in their own personal beliefs, to an extent that they are less open than I think they were in the past to listening to other people's ideas. So what happens is, and you see this rise in discussions like fake news and things like that, is the debate is no longer about what the message is, it's about who the messenger is. So I believe in Donald Trump, and I believe that CNN is fundamentally out to get Donald Trump. Even if CNN has something they believe that they can demonstrably show is true about Donald Trump, I'm going to say I prefer to believe Donald Trump over the media. It's the exact flip of that with when it was President Obama. If a conservative news network, so say Fox News, has demonstrably true information about Barack Obama, a Barack Obama supporter may say, I choose to believe Obama as opposed to Fox News. Even if it doesn't matter what the facts are anymore, it has to do with who the messenger is. So I think we've reached such a part, I think if you go back 15 or 20 years, you have a third of the people on this extreme, a third of the people on this extreme, and a third in the middle. Now I would say we have roughly 45% on this extreme, 45% on this extreme, and this little small 10% in the middle, and maybe be less than that. It's just a much harder, it's much harder now to have people have those open dialogues and to agree. So I think that's a big part of why there's this contentiousness in the Senate or in Congress and the President, is that the Democrats in the House, the Democrats in the Senate decided from day one, we are not going to do anything that President Trump wants to do. I would say it's very similar to how the Republicans worked with President Obama. And I think part of that was, I think, when President Obama started the Obamacare process, he left the Republicans out, and so they said, we're just not going to work with him again. We're going to try to obstruct him at every turn. Well, President Obama accomplished 2, maybe 3 things during his presidency legislatively. President Trump would probably be the same. That gridlock just is going to be here for quite some time.
Just think a little bit. I'm sorry. I'm sorry anything about this as a question, but the reason why I brought that up is because I think I seen on the news, Senator, I think his name is Senator Crocker, or I don't know.
Crocker, yeah.
Crocker, okay. Basically, like, I think he said that he backed Trump at first, but then now he's saying, like, I'm not backing him anymore.
Yeah.
So it's just the reason why I brought this up is because he's a Republican as well. So you're supposed to have your party on your side. So
right.
I'm asking you, like, why, if he controls the Senate, because if you control the Senate, you're supposed to get things passed, So
Sure.
I just wanna know.
The Senate's a little bit different because in the Senate, if they filibuster, it requires 60 votes to break a filibuster. The Republicans have 52 out of the 100 votes, so they've only got a very small majority. And so to pass anything through the Senate and to beat a filibuster, if the Democrats choose to do so, they would need to get 8 Democrats on their side. Even just to pass something without a filibuster, even taking that aside, if you have 52 Republicans, if you lose 3 of 52, you don't have a majority more. The Democrats are never going to vote with President Trump, and so you basically have to convince 50 of the 52, and then you get the Vice President to do something. Well, Senator Crocker from Tennessee, and it's interesting, they were supposed to have lunch today, Crocker and President Trump were supposed to have lunch today. If you lose someone like Senator Crocker, or Senator McCabe from Arizona, or Senator Collins from Maine, and Senator Collins from Maine rarely votes for Republican. She is a Republican, but she votes with the Democrats. You've already lost whatever it is you try to do in the Senate. So that makes it very, very difficult if you're a Republican president to pass anything to the Senate when you have to essentially get 100% of your members to vote with you. Not all those members who are really fans of his.
Can we stay federal for one more,
Yeah.
for at least one more question? Because we've talked a lot in this class, especially early in the semester, on the president's actions on DACA. What would you like to see done with Dreamers in this country?
Sure. So, full disclosure, I don't follow the federal stuff quite as much as the state stuff. and I have less strong opinions on it because we're so ingrained in doing state stuff. My knee-jerk reaction to that federal issue is that the DACA program, the people that are in the DACA program, they can't commit a crime where they immediately are sent back. They pay a certain amount of money a year. I believe they happen to be in school or gainfully employed. I actually think the DACA program seems to be working pretty well. And I think you will see that when the president initially said he was going to end it, and then he came back later and said, well, we're going to put a several month, whatever it is, and then at that point we're going to end it. I think there's some sense that they might be backing away from doing that. As far as I can tell, the program seems to work pretty well. But again, that's not an issue, and the federal issues are just not something that I'm quite as engaged as I am on state issues. So, we're going to go from first.
Okay. With the poverty here in Springfield, one of the schools, Robertson, is at 94.8% of their students are in free and reduced lunch. At the beginning of the year, 1/3 of that school population had cavities. 70% of those still have not seen a dentist. So my question is, as a strong proponent for the right to life, how do you propose supporting those children that would be born to mostly poor-stable women?
So currently, obviously, we have a fairly aggressive program, both locally through the Springfield Public Schools and then statewide, to provide services to low-income children. Outside of just the state services, there's also a bunch of private services. So like Ronald McDonald House has a traveling bus that does, they do checks on stuff, they do fillings, cabs, all that kind of thing. The biggest problem we have in Springfield is not so much the services offered, because we have a skimmed amount of services offered. A lot of it is information, trying to find those single parents or low-income parents that don't know about all the programs. So really, as much as anything, it's getting the information to them about the free or reduced services offered, I think would go a very long way to fixing this, or at least alleviating some of those problems. Back up.
First of all, thanks for coming. It's,
Yeah.
I think we can all say it's an honor having you here. But so my dad owns his own small construction company, and he always talks about how workman's comp has just been a major struggle for him. Like, he's wanted to grow his business, and he looks into it, that hire one more employee costs like X amount of money.
Yes.
So literally the government's de-incentivizing him to grow his own company. So I guess, would you support like a more linearized rate or just common sense reform to
So
workman's comp?
it's actually awesome you brought this up. So I grew up, my dad had his own construction company, and he used to have like 15 employees when we lived in Iowa, and then he eventually like shrunk it down until it was just us kids working for him. And he said the same thing. He's like, well, work comp's too expensive, I can't afford to hire anybody. So the question is, what specific proposals or what specific changes would he make to work comp? And the only reason I ask that is because I agree with you that work comp, especially the premiums, represent a barrier to small businesses hiring. The problem is you actually need, workers' compensation is set up through private marketplaces. And so the high premiums are essentially private insurance companies saying, well, it's kind of expensive to do that. What reforms would you have the government do to lower those premiums? Do you know?
Honestly, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But
And so I've contemplated that because in the years I've been in the legislature, we've done a little bit with the work comp system, but not a major rewrite other than something that had to do with something called the second injury fund, which doesn't really have a major impact on private insurance rates. I've gone through and tried to look at some of the fraud provisions and stuff like that, but I don't know. You know, there's quite a few that are already built into the system. For instance, there's a drug penalty provision that if you, let's say, does OTC have a drug-free policy?
Yes.
Okay, so let's say your professor came to work today, and let's say he was high on ecstasy, and he walks into the building, and then let's say, or actually as he's pulling into work, let's say somebody runs their car into him. Through no fault of his own, he has been injured on the job. Currently in Missouri, because OTC is a drug-free policy, and even though the accident was not his fault at all, his benefits are reduced by 50%. So they only have to pay for half his medical benefits, half his time off, and half his permanent disability. They only have to pay for half of it. On the other hand, let's say he's walking into the classroom, and because he's on ecstasy, he wanders out in the middle of the street, and then he gets hit. Because the ecstasy led to his work comp injury, the